I'm Linguist Gareth Roberts. Let's answer your questions from the internet about the history of English words. This is Etymology Support. Shatesy GG asks, is anyone else as fascinated by etymology, the origin of words and the historical development of its meaning as me? Or am I just a sad old man? How very dare you. If you are, it's not because of loving etymology. It's a kind of offshoot of historical linguistics, the study of language over time, how it changes. And it's really fascinating because it lets us lift up the lid of the simple words we use. Take the word gossip. A godsib was originally someone who had a sort of godfather or godmother relationship with you. They were related to you by those means. They would be people you might confide in, you might share social, personal information in. And so from there we get the word gossip as a person who shares gossip. From there we get the verb gossip. And this would have been in the Old English period that God and sib would have come together to form the word gossip. Lunaris says, dude and bro are gender neutral terms. Thoughts? This is actually quite common. Words becoming less or more gender neutral. So we can think of the word bro. Bro comes from brother, but then maybe they use it in a way that just includes friends. Maybe a woman uses it to refer to a female friend, and suddenly it doesn't have that gendering anymore. Sometimes the same thing happens in reverse. In Old English, the word man was a general word for people. The word for man as in male was wer. Wer really only survives in English in the word werewolf. Man has taken its place because this was a society where men were the default people. And if you refer to a default person, they tended to be male. Man ended up being associated in particular with males. The Old English word for man is also related to the word world. The word world in Proto-Germanic comes from word meaning man and the word alt meaning age. Age of man. This gives us some insight into how Germanic speakers saw themselves and their universe. There's another word in this area which has an interesting history. That's the word guy. So guy actually comes from the name of Guy Fawkes, who was captured in the Gunpowder Plot and executed horribly. And every year after that, in Britain, people celebrated catching and killing him by burning effigies of him on a big bonfire. And these effigies were known as guys. Kids would go around asking for a penny for the guy. People sometimes started using this to refer to someone who was disheveled, a sort of grotesque-looking human, a sort of insulting term for a man. You might call him a guy. And in America, interestingly, around the same kind of period, you get examples of people using the word just to refer to man generically. Lifted N Gifted Zero asks, who the came up with a silent letter? English spelling is weird. Take the word night or nor. Once upon a time, people genuinely did pronounce the K at the start of night. They'd say knicht, or they would pronounce the G at the start of nor. They'd say gnor. Over time in English, these things changed. People stopped pronouncing those, but we didn't update the spelling. We actually did used to say wolder and shoulder, the ancestors of would and should. We stopped pronouncing those L's, but we kept the L's in. But could never actually had the L in the first place. We just added that L because we wanted to make it match up with would and should. And we find this kind of thing also happening quite a lot with words that have been borrowed into the language. There was no B in the word doubt, either in English or in French. But the word came ultimately from the Latin word dubitare, which has a B. So at some point in the Middle Ages, both French and English scribes decided that perhaps we should put the B back in. Jenna Civi, someone just used the word unalived on BBC News. The news! And my dad turned to me and was like, I didn't know that was a word. This is one of those places where you have an effect of taboos. You have a taboo which is actually, if you like, implemented via social media. And so we end up trying to skirt around the words we're not meant to use and come up with words like unalived. And this happens quite a lot. We think, for instance, that the reason the English word bear isn't cognate with the word for bear in Latin or Welsh or Greek is that people didn't want to refer to bears because it felt to them perhaps as if they might invoke the horror of this big scary creature in using the word. So you'd expect modern English word for bear to be cognate with the French word ours, which comes from this Proto-Indo-European word pronounced something like hurtus. Instead, bear seems to trace back to bear in Proto-Indo-European, meaning brown. This is not the only theory. There are some other theories about where the modern English word bear comes from, but we know for sure it does not come from the same place as most of the other Indo-European languages got their words bear from. XND Lou, reading about Grimm's law for the nth time and I still ain't understanding So Grimm's law refers to a set of sound changes which happened to occur in the Germanic languages like English millennia ago in the emergence of Proto-Germanic from Proto-Indo-European. P became F in the Germanic languages, K became H. For example, here are some words in English: fish, father, hound, head, and their cognates in Latin. Piscis, pater, canis, caput. The P's in Latin correspond to F's in English, and the C's in Latin correspond to H's in English. You can get an idea about how certain changes happen by imagining pronouncing the same sound over and over again. Pa, 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 pa. And you might notice if you do this a lot that the P maybe slips slightly and you end up, rather than with a P sound, with a F sound. This is essentially what happened in the history of the Germanic languages. Lights for FitF says, it sits there and I can't stop thinking about how swear words are invented. Like, who said the word f one day and decided it was forbidden? There's a whole bunch of things that people don't really like talking about. Sex is one of these things. Defecation is another. We sometimes feel odd talking about death, and very often we'll introduce a euphemism. For example, at some point, people didn't want to use whatever word they had at the time to refer to urination, so they started imitating the sound that people make when they urinate, pss, and that's the origin of the word piss in Latin, pisciare. More recently, the word piss itself stopped feeling so euphemistic, so we ended up using the word pee simply by taking the first letter of piss and using that to refer to urination. Similar to F for F off. Tonya MJ_ writes, you'll just be making up words. Yes, quite literally that's what we did as humans to create language. Or do you think a man in the sky just dropped the Oxford English Dictionary on the Neanderthal on his way back to his cave? Yes. We make up words all the time. What's interesting though is we very rarely make up words from nothing. Let's say you have a pet frog and you make a house for your pet frog. You're unlikely to invent a completely new word for that. You'll probably just call it a frog house. You'll take the words frog and house and combine them and make a new word. The other thing people sometimes do is they will use iconic forms to refer to something when they don't think they have enough in common with the person they're talking to for an existing word to work. For example, let's imagine you're trying to convey to someone who doesn't speak your language that you want cow's milk. Maybe what you'll do is my milky cow, you'll glub, 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 moo. What you've done there is created an iconic form, and maybe you'll meet this person multiple times in the future, and you probably won't go through the whole charade every time of glub, 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 moo. Maybe the next time you meet them, you'll say something like glub, moo. And that is not dissimilar from what's happened many times in the history of language. Another example, the word but in English originally meant outside. Outside implies physical separation. It implies that something is not within the other thing. It's a short step from there to meaning without. You have something without the other thing because that thing is now outside it. That shifted to be used in an abstract sense to mean accept. Everything except that tree. Everything except this book. And over time, this meaning of without or accept shifted even further to mean but, to make a contrast between two parts of a sentence. VLVTRSE_. One thing that fascinates me about the human experience is the development of language. Like, how did each language form? Was there one common language at one point? Mind-blowing. Languages have quite likely been around for at least 100,000 years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. We actually don't know whether all vocal languages have one common ancestor. They could have arisen all in one place and then spread out, or it could be that actually languages arose in different places. Most European languages and a number of Asian languages do belong to the same family. They have the same common ancestor, which for convenience we call Proto-Indo-European. So Proto-Indo-European would have been spoken around 6,000 years ago. The people who spoke it were quite possibly nomadic pastoralists. They lived in the Pontic Caspian steppe, a bit north of the Black Sea, around where part of modern Ukraine and southern Russia are. Based on what we can infer from the words they had for things, we can trace back words for different dairy products, for cows. We can trace back words for wheels, for wagons, for houses, for doors with roofs and pegs to hold the doors closed. So we could reconstruct an image of how Proto-Indo-European speakers lived, with implications that perhaps they led a somewhat nomadic pastoral existence. And this is a language which has a number of modern descendants. We can put these languages on a language tree like this. And for instance, we can imagine that this is the Germanic branch here, and then we have languages like Dutch, Frisian, English branching out of this. These languages then are going to be related to each other and ultimately related to other languages in the same tree. In this case, the Indo-European language family, we have languages like French, Italian, the Romance languages, Celtic languages like Welsh and Irish. We have Slavic languages like Russian and Polish, languages like Hindi, like Persian, and so on. Words in these languages which come from a common root would be cognates. That is, they share an ancestor. Let's take a word like English father. We can actually compare the words vater and father in the Germanic branch with other words in other Indo-European languages, like the Latin word pater. And if we compare these, we find they also sound kind of potentially similar. And we can trace these words back. The asterisk here indicates that this is not a word we've ever actually seen. This is reconstructed. So 6,000 years ago, people were calling their fathers something which sounds eerily similar to the modern word father. This root also turns up in other places. If you take the name of the Roman god Jupiter, that pater bit is from the same place, means father. The first part comes from a word meaning day or sky. So what we have is Deus Pater, sky father. People essentially worshipping the sun and the sky. And this we see all through Indo-European languages too. We can trace back the Indo-European languages to Proto-Indo-European. We can trace back the Afro-Asiatic languages to Proto-Afro-Asiatic, which will take us back about 17,000 years roughly. But we can't, unfortunately, go back and trace common ancestors for these language families, these reconstructed languages, because the noise to signal ratio gets too high. We can no longer feel confident about our reconstructions. Sarcasm, language was first developed 100,000 years ago. People before that. So what were people doing before language came about? Part of the story is that while language is quite specific to humans, communication is everywhere. Before there was language, human beings were communicating. We were making sounds, we were using gestures. We even see this now in other primate species like chimps. We evolved to be able to do things like complex syntax, rules and constraints that organize words into sentences, complex meanings. So imagine that you're speaking a language 10,000 years ago and you've just encountered an animal which has claws, little ears, and it makes a sort of meow sound. And you want to tell someone about this animal. You don't have a word for it. No one has ever named this animal that you've ever heard before. What are you going to call it? Well, there's a good chance you might call it something like a meow or a mew or something along those lines. In fact, if you look at the word for cat in the ancient Egyptian language, you actually find that the word for cat looks quite a lot like the word mew. Instances of this in modern vocal languages as well. Onomatopoeia, of course, we have words like bang, which sounds a bit like a bang. Animal noises, woof, 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 meow. They resemble the actual sounds that the animals make. Words like dada and mama and papa. These are based on the babbling sounds that babies make. So babies go through a stage where they start babbling. We parents tend to be fairly self-centered people. We like to assume that our babies are talking about us. So this is almost certainly where the Proto-Indo-European word pater came from, meaning father. It would have started off as something like papa. And these words keep getting reinvented. So we end up in English with a word like father, but then we also listen to our babies babbling and we reintroduce words like dada and daddy. All over the world, these mama, papa, dada words keep getting reintroduced as parents listen to their babies babbling. Clive Durdle asks, where did the word orange come from? The word orange came into English from French, and French got it from Spanish, which got it from Arabic, which got it from Sanskrit, and so on. What's interesting here is the Spanish word is naranja, starting with an N. The N became associated with the indefinite article. So it's like instead of saying norange, you reinterpret that as an orange. And this actually happened a few times in the history of words. So apron originally was napron, reinterpreted as an apron. And the Old English word for snake, nadder, was reinterpreted as an adder. So sometimes mistakes can give birth to new forms of words. Shaylee says, shout out to the guy who invented the word poop. That is dead ass. Poop for real. The word poop actually probably meant something more like fart originally. So it seems to be onomatopoeic, poo, with a meaning similar to puff. That is, it represents the sound made by a puff of air. So it probably meant something a bit like fart, and then started to be used euphemistically to refer to other things that come out of your butt. Critical Stressy asks, why do Americans say fall when autumn was a perfectly good word for the season? Neither fall nor autumn was actually the original English word. Fall seems to be first recorded some point in the 16th century in English to refer to autumn. But before that, English speakers actually referred to autumn as harvest. This is cognate with the words in other Germanic languages like German Herbst, meaning autumn. In England, that got quite specific, referring to the gathering of the crops in the autumn. So in the 16th century, both fall and autumn were being used to some extent in Britain to refer to the season. Fall, the fall of the leaves, comes from the Old English word fall. Autumn are borrowing from Latin via French. Insane Artist, demure was a good word until everyone started using it. Good question, very mindful. The word demure has actually been around since Middle English and probably comes from French mûr, meaning mature. It's actually cognate with the word mature. We don't actually know where the de part comes from. No French word demure as far as we're aware. But recently it's got kind of popular on TikTok, and people have been using the phrase very demure, very mindful, to refer to a whole bunch of things. And I think this is an example of how people love to have fun with language. People like to be ironic. They like to use words like wicked to mean good, using expressions that get a good reaction from people. Ali Padrino, dude, I'm deaf getting old. What is this new slang these kids got? What's the YNS era? What the f is FOMO? Why are you all typing CS for cuz or TS for that shit? I'm so lost. I think this is something which happens every single generation. This is likely something which has happened since language has existed. And I think this is two-sided. Kids, on the one hand, don't want to sound like their parents or their parents' generation. Slang words don't tend to come down to us in the written records of ancient languages, mainly because those tend to be formal writing and slang words tend not to get written down in formal writing very often. You do see slang words sometimes written in ancient graffiti, often sexual slang, things like that. But we also get hints of other kinds of slang surviving into modern languages as ordinary words, in the same kind of way as cool, which at one point was basically a slang word. The Latin word for head, if you looked it up in a Latin dictionary, is caput. This is actually cognate with the English word head. But if you look at the modern Romance languages, you don't find the word caput meaning head. You find words like testa in Italian. At some point, people started using the word testa, which originally meant pot or potsherd, to refer to skulls, and from then to use this word which had come to mean skull to refer to people's heads. Kaylee Jadar, who invented the word no? We don't know. No goes back ultimately to Proto-Indo-European. The English word no is actually a shortening of none, which comes from ne an, meaning not one. And the ne part is actually very similar to its Proto-Indo-European ancestor ne. And that survives in lots of modern Indo-European languages. We don't know what the origin is of this word, but one possibility that's been suggested is it actually goes back to the kind of face that maybe babies make when they refuse something, the no face. Hot girl Mara says, I'm starving to death, I'm dying, and my girlfriend won't choose a restaurant because she's too busy telling me about the Great Vowel Shift. I really sympathize. You should never do linguistics on an empty stomach. But the Great Vowel Shift is really interesting. To understand it, it helps to understand a bit about what vowels are and how they work. This is a model of the human vocal tract. The mouth at this end, tongue here, we have the larynx here. We push air up from the lungs through the larynx, and then we shape our vocal tract by moving our lips and tongue and teeth. Now, linguists are very used to working with a schematic diagram of this tract when we talk about vowels. In the late 14th century, people started to pronounce these vowels differently. Where bet was pronounced originally with the tongue at the sort of mid-front part of the mouth, people started moving it further up and closer to the top front of the mouth. It started sounding more like beat. And this vowel actually became more of a diphthong, a combination of two vowel sounds, I, and we end up with beat and bite. Similarly, bought became boat, and boat became boot, and boot became bout. Mars Catland says, Shakespeare just misspelled and made words up and hoped motherfuckers would cope with it, and they did. Shakespeare did not invent anywhere near as many words as people think. Other writers of the same period actually had similar or even larger vocabularies. Lots and lots of people who were contributing dictionary entries had copies of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the first place they found many instances of some of these words. He might, in many cases, have been the first person who wrote some of these words down, but that doesn't mean that he invented them. He came up with many fantastic turns of phrase like one fell swoop. Other words like mockable, for instance, might be that Shakespeare was the first person to use the word mockable. These are productive morphemes in language that are quite easy to combine. Oh my Lantis asks, why did we stop saying thee and thou? Like, I'm honestly not sure how to use them in a sentence. It's actually kind of interesting that English stopped using thee and thou because their cognates, like French tu, Russian tu, stayed around in those languages. So thee and thou were originally second person singular. You, when you were referring to just one person. You was originally the plural form. But around the early medieval period, people started to use you for singulars as well. This started in Latin. You had tu and vos, tu being the singular you, vos being plural you. But people started using vos also when they were talking to one person, but they wanted to be respectful to them. Some people have suggested that this was because there were two emperors. There was the emperor in Rome, emperor in Constantinople. There were these two centers of the Roman Empire for a while. It's also possible that people just considered that the word for more people was somehow the more respectful form. Around the 17th century, somewhat abruptly, people, especially the southeast of England, started to drop thou and thee. Also around this time, you had certain religious groups like the Quakers using thou and thee for everyone. And this was not necessarily very popular, so people might have wanted to distance themselves from that usage. Soft Playband says, word is a word invented, call words words. Word. Weird. Yeah, it is kind of weird. The English word word comes from an Indo-European root, in fact, originally meaning speech with an ending on it, which originally meant something like put, and this was used to indicate completed action. So word means something like spoken. It's something that has been spoken. Benjamin ST25020 asks, who invented the word pregnant? Because that's such a weird word to just come up with. Well, actually, this one turns out to be quite simple. The pre-bit in pregnant, as in prepare and lots of other words, just means before. The nant bit comes from a word nasty, meaning give birth. So being pregnant is the state you're in before you give birth. Nasty is actually a cognate with words like genesis and generate. Actually, it turns out there are more interesting words than being pregnant. Take, for example, the Spanish word embarazado. This is clearly related to the English word embarrassed. It comes originally from an Arabic word, maraza, meaning rope. This was borrowed into Portuguese and then into Spanish as baraza and gave birth to a word meaning entangled. This is a concrete word originally, referring to people being entangled in a rope, but it came quite rapidly to refer to a more abstract sense of being entangled or inconvenienced, which is where we get the word embarrassed, ultimately. This entangled, inconvenienced meaning was used as a euphemism for pregnant, hence the Spanish word embarazado. Dewey Wrights says, something that always fascinates me. We don't know where the word dog comes from. It just appeared in late medieval English from no apparent root word. This is actually a mystery in etymology. We might have expected the word hound in modern English to be the usual word for dog. Instead, hound became more specialized and the general word for dog is dog. And we don't quite know where it comes from. But dog is actually one of a set of words, along with pig, hog, frog, all ending in G in modern English, which in Old English seem to have had this CGA ending, so dotka, frotka, hodka, pigka. This is a little bit mysterious. We don't quite know where this came in. And these are words which we don't see recorded all that often in writing. What most likely happened is that these were kind of cute, expressive words that were maybe used in the nursery or when people wanted to talk in a cute way about dogs. And so they didn't tend to end up in formal writing. When people use the word doggo now, they might be taking the word dog back to its origins. So that's all the questions. Thanks for listening. This has been Etymology Support.